My twin sister took my room for her baby. They made me sleep 4 months in a tent while spending my $50K inheritance. But years later, they came begging to live in my house. I sued them and the judge left them broke. I'm 28 years old. I work as a shift manager at a pretty decent restaurant. And the truth is, I need to tell this story because a few weeks ago my family showed up at my door and everything I'd buried for years came to the surface in the worst possible way. I guess I should start from the beginning. When I was born. Because basically from that moment my parents made it clear that I wasn't what they wanted. I was born a twin. You know? My sister Melissa came first. And I came like 10 minutes later. And apparently, those 10 minutes were enough for my parents to decide who deserved their love and who didn't. I'm not exaggerating when I say that for as long as I can remember. They always preferred Melissa over me. And it wasn't subtle. It was so obvious that even the neighbors noticed it and felt uncomfortable. When we were little kids, like 5 or 6 years old, Melissa always had the new toys, the pretty clothes, the elaborate birthday parties with all our classmates invited, while I got her hand-me-downs or straight up nothing. I remember one birthday. I think we were turning 8, and my parents threw Melissa this huge party at a play place with bounce houses and everything. They invited like 30 kids, and when one of the parents asked me where my party was, my mother literally said, "Oh, we celebrate both together," as if the fact that I was standing there watching them celebrate her counted as my party too. They didn't even sing happy birthday using my name. They just said, "Happy birthday, Melissa," and that was it. I ate a piece of cake in a corner and then went to my room, and my parents didn't even notice I'd left. I mean, they didn't even care. The only person in my family who ever made me feel loved was my paternal grandfather, my father's dad. He was an older man, you know, one of those gruff guys who doesn't talk much, but when he does, it's because he has something important to say. He lived like 2 hours away from us, but he'd come visit every 2 or 3 months, and always treated me the same as Melissa. He'd buy us both gifts, hug us both, ask us both how school was going. I remember once, when we were like 11 years old, he came to visit and noticed I was wearing clothes that were clearly too small, while Melissa had a completely new outfit, and he asked my father why, and my father just shrugged and said something about how I didn't take care of my clothes so I didn't deserve new things. Which was a total lie, because I treated my clothes like gold, because I knew I wasn't going to get more. My grandfather didn't say anything at that moment, but the next day he took me shopping, just me, and bought me like 6 complete outfits, new shoes, a new backpack for school, everything. My parents were furious when we got back. They said my grandfather was spoiling me and that he was going to ruin me, which is ridiculous considering how they had Melissa living like a princess all the time. When we were like 13, my grandfather got sick. It was cancer. One of those aggressive ones that doesn't give you much time. And within months, he went from being that strong man I knew to being in a hospital bed, unable to even walk. I visited him every chance I got. Took 2 buses to get to the hospital, because my parents never took me. They said they were too busy, but they always had time to take Melissa to the mall or movies with her friends. My grandfather died when I was 14, and honestly it was like losing the only person in the world who truly loved me, you know? At his funeral I was devastated, crying nonstop, and my mother told me to stop being dramatic, that I was ruining the moment for everyone else with my exaggerated crying. Melissa didn't even cry. She was more worried about a text message she'd received from whoever. Fast forward to when we were 16, and this is where everything got really horrible. Melissa started dating this guy. Frank. Wait, no. That wasn't him. That was the bakery guy. My sister's boyfriend was named. I don't really remember his name well. Mike or Matt or something like that. Doesn't really matter. The point is, this guy was 19 years old, worked dead-end jobs. You know, one day at a gas station, another day delivering pizzas, that kind of thing. And my parents loved him because he treated Melissa like she was made of glass. I thought he was a loser, but nobody asked my opinion. Obviously. So anyway, in October of that year, Melissa comes home crying, and turns out she's pregnant. She's 16 years old and pregnant by a 19-year-old who can barely pay for his gas. And my parents, instead of getting angry or worried or whatever normal parents do in that situation, start planning how they're going to support her, saying things like, "We're going to get through this together and we're going to make it work and this baby is going to be so loved." 2 weeks later, my parents sit me down in the living room and tell me they need to talk to me. I thought they were finally going to acknowledge that they'd been unfair to me all those years, that maybe the situation with Melissa had made them reflect or something. But no. They told me that Melissa was going to need the room for her and the baby, that a baby needs space and privacy, and that I was going to have to move out. Just like that, move out, at 16 years old, in the middle of the school year. I asked them where I was supposed to go, and my father said, "I don't know. That's your problem. Maybe with a friend or something. But we need you out of this house." And when I say I was shocked, I was literally frozen there sitting, waiting for them to say it was a joke. But no, they were serious. My mother added that I had 2 weeks to find something and pack my things, and that if I didn't leave voluntarily, they were going to throw my stuff out on the street anyway. I had nowhere to go. Literally, I had absolutely no one. I didn't have close friends because I'd spent my entire adolescence feeling so miserable at home that I hadn't made the effort to build strong relationships, and my grandfather's family, which was like 3 cousins and an aunt, lived in another state and basically didn't know me because my parents never took us to family gatherings. I thought about talking to some teacher or school counselor, but I was embarrassed to admit that my own parents were kicking me out of the house. I felt like they were going to think I'd done something terrible to deserve that. 2 weeks passed and I hadn't found anything, obviously, because how is a 16-year-old girl going to find a place to live with no money or support? And just like they promised, my parents put all my stuff in the backyard. They didn't throw it out on the street like they'd threatened, but they put it in the back patio and told me I could sleep there in a tent they found in the garage until I figured things out. I slept in that tent for 4 months, like from October to February, and I don't know if you've ever spent a winter sleeping outside, but it's horrible, absolutely miserable. I had a sleeping bag that was for mild weather, not for freezing, and every night I'd lay down shivering, wearing all the clothes I had on top of me, and I couldn't sleep well because every noise would wake me up thinking something was going to happen. My parents let me use the house bathroom. I mean, how generous. And I could shower in the mornings before going to school, but that was it. I couldn't go in for anything else. I'd see Melissa through the window of what had been my room, decorating it for the baby, painting the walls yellow, putting up these little animal stickers, and she never, not once, came out to ask if I was okay or if I needed anything. School became almost impossible. I'd arrive exhausted, cold, hungry, because my parents didn't give me food. They only let me eat if there was something left over after they finished, and obviously I couldn't concentrate in classes. My grades went to hell. I went from being an average student to almost failing everything, and the teachers thought it was teenage rebellion or something. They didn't know I was living in a tent in my house's backyard. I desperately needed money, like to buy food at least. So I started looking for work, and I found this place, a bakery in the center of town called Frank's Bakery. Kind of ironic because the owner's name was Frank, an older man, like 60 years old, no family, who'd had that business for decades. I went in one day after school, like in November, I think, and asked him if he needed help. And he looked me up and down, saw my dirty clothes, my tired eyes, and asked me how old I was. I told him 16, but that I was very responsible, that I needed the job. And he sighed and said, "I can give you 4 hours on weekdays after school and 6 hours on Saturdays. Cleaning, making deliveries, that kind of thing. I'll pay you cash." It wasn't much money, but it was something. And I accepted immediately. Frank was a gruff guy, didn't talk much, always had his brow furrowed, but he was fair, paid me on time, and after a few weeks he started giving me bread and pastries left over from the day, which honestly saved my life because it was most of what I ate. In December, it was so cold I honestly thought I was going to freeze to death in that tent. One morning Frank noticed I arrived, shaking so much I could barely hold the broom, and he asked me what was wrong. At first I told him nothing, but he insisted, and I ended up telling him the whole story, crying there in the back room of the bakery, telling him my parents had kicked me out, that I was living outside, that I didn't know what to do. I expected him to tell me he was sorry and give me some advice. But instead, he told me, "There's a room above the bakery. I use it to store things, but it has an old bed and a heater. You can stay there if you want. I'm not going to charge you rent, but you have to keep it clean and keep working hard." I don't know if you've ever felt that kind of relief that makes you cry harder, but that's what happened. I thanked him like 1,000 times. And that night, I moved my stuff from my parents' backyard to that room above the bakery. The room was small, like, very small. It had a single bed with a mattress that had seen better days, an old desk, a little window facing the main street, and an electric heater that made a weird noise but worked. It was perfect. It was 1,000 times better than the tent. And for the first time in months, I felt almost human again. Frank never made me feel like I owed him anything more than honest work. He was never weird or invasive. He was just an older man who saw a girl in trouble and decided to help. I started working more hours, staying after my shift to clean better, organizing inventory, learning how to make some of the simpler bread recipes, and Frank would teach me, let me experiment, pay me for every extra hour I worked. My parents didn't even notice I'd left the backyard, or if they noticed, they didn't care enough to ask. Melissa had her baby in April, a girl, and my parents went completely crazy over her, buying her everything, taking photos constantly, posting on Facebook every moment, calling her our precious little granddaughter. I kept going to school, barely. I managed to graduate by a miracle considering everything. And after graduating, I got a second job at a restaurant as a waitress, working full-time at the bakery and then nights at the restaurant, sleeping like 4 or 5 hours a night, saving every penny I could. I had no social life, didn't go to parties or do anything that normal 17, 18-year-olds do. I just worked, slept, slept. People at the restaurant started noticing I was good with customers, that I was fast, that I never complained, and the manager offered me more hours, double shifts on weekends, and I accepted everything. Melissa's boyfriend, that 19-year-old guy, well, by the time the baby was born, he was already 20, moved into my parents' house with her, and from what I heard, because the town is small and everyone talks, he kept jumping from job to job, not settling into anything, and my parents basically supported all three of them, Melissa, him, and the baby. Years went by like that, me working like crazy, saving everything, living in that little room above the bakery. Frank got sick when I was like 23. Nothing serious, but enough that he needed more help in the bakery, and basically I ended up running the place while he recovered. When he got better, he raised my salary without me asking, told me I'd proven to be more reliable than any employee he'd had in 40 years, and that coming from Frank, who didn't give easy compliments, meant a lot to me. At 25, I'd saved enough money to think about buying a house. Something small, nothing fancy, but mine. I found this place on the outskirts of town. A 3-bedroom house, 1 bathroom, small yard, needed some work, but was within my budget if I got a loan, and after months of paperwork and nerves, I bought it. The day I got the keys, I cried in my car for like 20 minutes. I couldn't believe I'd actually achieved this. That despite everything, that my parents had abandoned me, that I'd slept in a tent in the middle of winter, that I'd worked to exhaustion for years. I had my own house. I fixed it up little by little, painting the walls on my days off, buying secondhand furniture, making it feel like a home, my home. I didn't tell my parents I'd bought a house. I hadn't spoken to them in years at that point, not since I left their backyard, and honestly, I didn't think about them much. I'd built my life without them and I was fine that way. 3 weeks ago, on a Saturday afternoon, I was in my living room, watching TV after a long shift, and someone knocked on the door. I opened it and it was my entire family. My parents, Melissa, her husband, and her daughter who was already like 9 years old. I stood there in shock because I hadn't seen them in almost 10 years, and my mother, without even saying hello or how are you, says, "We heard you bought a house. It has 3 bedrooms, right?" And I just nodded because I didn't know what else to do. I was so confused about what they were doing there. My father then says, "Well, we need to move. The situation at our house got complicated. You know, financially speaking, and we thought we could stay here with you. There's enough space for everyone." They weren't asking, they were assuming, as if it was a given that I was going to open my house to them after everything they did to me. Melissa added, "Yeah, the girl can stay in one room, us in another, and mom and dad in the third. It's going to work perfectly." I just stared at them, processing what they were saying, and then something in me broke, or rather, something in me fixed itself. Like all those emotions I'd kept for years came out all at once. I told them no, that absolutely not. That they had kicked me out of their house when I was 16 years old, that they'd made me sleep in a tent in the cold, that they never worried if I was alive or dead, and that they had no right to show up now expecting me to help them. My father turned red with rage, started yelling that I was ungrateful, that after everything they did for me I was turning my back on them, and I laughed. I literally laughed in his face and said, What exactly did you do for me? Let me use your bathroom while I lived outside? How generous. My mother started with how family helps each other, that it was my duty as a daughter, and I told them they'd stopped being my family the day they put my stuff in the backyard. Melissa was quiet, but looking at me with that face like I was being dramatic, and that made me angrier. I told them to get off my property, that if they didn't leave, I'd call the police. And after more yelling and threats, they finally left. I thought that was it, that they'd gotten the message. But 2 days later, I received a letter from a lawyer. Melissa had filed a lawsuit claiming that the house I bought should be considered family property because, according to her, part of the money I used to buy it came from shared family resources, which was completely absurd because every penny I used I earned working. I hired a lawyer, Karen, a no-nonsense woman I liked immediately, and she started reviewing my case. During her investigation, Karen discovered something I didn't know, something that changed everything. Turns out when my grandfather died, he'd left me an inheritance in his will. I don't know exactly how much, but it was a considerable amount, like enough to have paid for my college or bought a car or just have a financial cushion, and my parents never told me anything about it. Karen found documents showing that my parents had used that money for themselves, to pay their debts, to buy things for Melissa, to support themselves while Melissa raised her daughter. Basically, they'd stolen from me. They'd stolen the only thing my grandfather, the only person who loved me, had left me. When Karen showed me the documents, I was so angry I couldn't even speak. I felt like my head was going to explode, and she told me, "We can sue them for fraud and theft. We can recover that money plus interest." And I told her, yes, let's do that, that it was time they faced consequences. The legal process was long, like 6 months of back and forth, documents and depositions, and my parents hired a cheap lawyer who basically didn't know what to do against Karen. They tried to argue that the money had been used for the benefit of the whole family, that I'd also benefited indirectly. But Karen proved that I'd been living in a tent, and then in a borrowed room, while they spent my inheritance on nonsense. The judge, an older woman who seemed very tired of these kinds of cases, reviewed all the evidence, heard arguments from both sides, and finally issued her ruling. The judge ruled that my parents had to return all the inheritance to me, with interest calculated from the date of my grandfather's death until now, which ended up being an even larger amount than what they'd originally left me. She also completely dismissed Melissa's lawsuit about my house, saying it was frivolous and without merit, and ordered her to pay my legal costs for that case too. I left that courtroom feeling vindicated, feeling that for the first time in my life, someone in authority had acknowledged that what they'd done to me was wrong, that I wasn't crazy, that they'd been terrible to me. My parents have to pay me in installments because they don't have all the money, obviously, because they spent it all, so I'm going to be receiving monthly payments for the next few years. Melissa tried calling me after the trial, leaving me crying voicemails, saying it wasn't fair, that I was destroying the family, and I never returned her calls. I just blocked her number and moved on. I changed my phone number, made sure they didn't know my current work address because now I'm a shift manager at a different restaurant, bigger, and basically cut them completely out of my life. It's been 3 weeks since the trial, and I'm fine. Honestly, I'm better than fine. I go out with my coworkers sometimes. I'm thinking about adopting a dog. I'm taking online classes to improve my management skills. And for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm building something for myself, something nobody can take away from me. I still think about my grandfather sometimes, about how he was the only person who saw me as valuable. And I like to think he'd be proud of how things turned out, that I finally used what he left me to build the life he would have wanted me to have. I don't know if my parents or Melissa are going to try to contact me again, but if they do, I already know exactly what to tell them. Absolutely nothing, because I don't owe them my time or my words, and I definitely don't owe them my forgiveness.